Now, there's no way to be 100% certain about it. But the reactions at this point by President Kennedy and Governor Connally seem to be simultaneous. I have to believe that there's a high probability that one bullet passed through both of them. It appears that shot was fired at frame 223, blowing Governor Connally's jacket open on the right side. The expulsion of blood and tissue caused the governor's tie to be blown to his left. It's easier to see what happened by watching the sequence of frames, including those just before and just after 223. The jacket has clearly been blown open, exposing a larger portion of his white dress shirt. Because his right arm was resting on the jacket, it held the coat taut, so that the jacket snapped immediately back into place after the bullet had passed. This is the sequence again. In the past, some researchers thought the passing bullet hit the lapel, causing it to flip over, but the bullet actually exited several inches to the right of the lapel, so that couldn't have been the cause. President Kennedy's arms first began to rise at frame 226, 3 frames or 1/6 of a second later. Some critics have argued that his reaction was too fast, suggesting that he must have been hit earlier, but it's important to understand the nature of those reactions. People have always believed that he was raising his hands to his throat, but that's not what he was doing. Try an experiment here. Raise your own hands to your throat. Now look at your elbows. Why did they remain at your side rather than rise like President Kennedy's did? The location where the president was hit in the back was very close to cervical vertebrae number 7, which just happens to be the place where nerves are located that connect directly to the elbow extensors, which are the muscles that cause the elbows to go up and down. And as any neurologist will tell you, such reactions are extremely fast because unlike reactions to loud noises, the nerves are stimulated directly without having to first be processed by the brain. But there is something else about this shot that's even more important than the single bullet theory, and that's the fact that no one heard it. We already know that the large majority of witnesses reported hearing only one early shot, and that seems to have been the one that was fired just before frame 170. One important confirmation is that Mrs. Kennedy said she was looking to her left when she heard that noise, as we see her at frame 170, just before she turns back toward her husband. But by frame 223, when the next shot was fired, she was turned fully to her right. So if Mrs. Kennedy was correct, she must have heard that noise when the earlier of those 2 shots was fired. Another extremely important clue comes from Governor Connally, who testified that he never heard the shot that hit him. Connally remained fully conscious at the time and heard people around him talking, but like most others in Dealey Plaza that day, he never heard the shot that wounded him and probably President Kennedy. One of the greatest myths associated with this case was the claim that shots from Oswald's rifle were drowned out by the crowd noise or the motorcycles. But when the House Select Committee on Assassinations tested an identical rifle in Dealey Plaza, they found out how loud it really was. The House Select Committee on Assassinations tested that rifle in Dealey Plaza by positioning microphones at various distances from the alleged sniper's nest and then measuring the sound levels when shots were fired. The first sound that witnesses heard was actually the bullet's shock wave, which by the way comes directly from the bullet itself rather than the rifle. It generated a brief but extremely loud noise, which was measured at 130 decibels within 10 feet of the bullet's path. The muzzle blast followed almost immediately behind the shock wave. Any shots that were fired from the alleged murder weapon would have exposed the people in the limousine to sound levels between 115 and 135 decibels. So, how loud is 115 to 135 decibels? Well, a noisy vacuum cleaner will typically generate sound levels between 70 and 80 decibels. 90 decibels is the level that's commonly used by psychologists to startle test subjects. That also happens to be the level at which prolonged exposure can cause permanent hearing loss. Now, sound levels double every 10 decibels. So 100 decibels is twice as loud as 90. 110 is twice as loud as 100, and so on. Therefore, the people who rode with President Kennedy were exposed to extremely high levels that were up to 16 times as loud as the levels used by psychologists, and 50% louder than you would hear standing 4 feet from a pneumatic riveter. In fact, the people who conducted the test were really surprised at how loud the gunshots really were. They couldn't understand how anybody could have misconstrued them to be firecrackers or backfires. They also brought in motorcycles to see if they would drown out the sound of the shots. But the motorcycles didn't make any difference, and they concluded that the shots were so loud that any reasonable level of background noise would have been low in comparison with the shots themselves. So by studying the visible reactions of the limo passengers, we can easily see when they were exposed to high-powered rifle shots which could have been fired by Oswald, and when they were not. The witnesses basically told us they heard no particularly loud shots until the very end of the attack, and studying them in the film, it's clear that they were correct. The next question we'll address is, where did the single bullet theory shot come from? Was it the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository? Or was it more likely that it came from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building? Interestingly, some of the people who tried hardest to prove that the shot was fired by Oswald wound up proving exactly the opposite. This is from a documentary presented on the Discovery Channel. Their team set up a tower at exactly the height of that 6th floor window, and they placed their models in exactly the same relative positions to President Kennedy and Governor Connally. Watch what happened.
Amazingly, Alex has replicated the magic bullet shot.
But contrary to what the narrator told us, the path of their bullet was way off. It should have hit Governor Connally at about the level of his armpit. The red line, by the way, was theirs. Now compare that with the trajectory from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building. The alignment is perfect. Over the years, no one has worked harder to promote the lone nut theory than Dale Myers. But look at this image from his own 3D animation, which also appeared on the Discovery Channel. This was from his 3D animation, which included a trajectory line going back to the 6th floor of the depository. But if we extend Myers' own line, we see that like the other Discovery Channel presentation, it strikes Governor Connally much too low. Once again, we can compare it with a shot from the 3rd floor of the Daltex building. And once again, the alignment is perfect. The House Select Committee on Assassinations recognized this problem and tried to compensate for it by claiming that JFK was leaning forward much further than he actually was. This is their illustration. But what about the horizontal angle? This image was carefully calculated by experts for the House Select Committee on Assassinations and based on very precise measurements taken by surveyors. Notice that they had to move Connally far to the left side of his seat in order to make it work. They had to do that because the angle from the depository was between 9 and 10 degrees. Now, more recent theories, which place the single bullet theory a bit later, still require an angle of around 7 to 8 degrees. But there was absolutely no good reason to misposition Governor Connally that way. If we put him back to a plausible position in the center of his car seat, we find that the correct horizontal angle for that shot would have to have been around 2 degrees. Please look closely at this diagram of Dealey Plaza. That 2-degree angle points directly back to the same window in the Daltex building. But is there really any reason to suspect that there might be someone up there who would want to kill President Kennedy?